Welcome to Restoria. I'm Edward, and this is your quiet place for gentle bedtime stories. Get comfortable, take a breath, and let the story ease you into sleep. The Recipe Tin. The road into Linden was the same road it had always been, narrow and slow, lined with hedges that had grown taller than Mara remembered. The light through the windscreen was the soft yellow of late afternoon, the kind that made even ordinary fields look like something a painter had spent a long time on. She drove with the window cracked, one elbow resting on the door, listening to the small, steady hum of the engine and the gentler hum of bees in the hedgerow whenever she slowed for a bend. She had not been here in a long time. She had stopped in the village on the way through, parked outside the little shop by the green, gone in for the things she would need. The shop smelled of bread and floor polish and the faint dustiness of paper bags. The woman behind the counter had looked at her for a long moment with the polite curiosity of someone in a small place trying to place a face, and then her expression had softened into recognition. "Beth's granddaughter," she had said quietly, almost to herself. Mara had nodded, and the woman had nodded back, and nothing more had needed to be said. The butter was wrapped in brown paper. The milk was in a glass bottle, a small bag of oats, a handful of plump dried fruit in case she wanted any. The woman had refused the change and slid 2 boiled sweets across the counter, with the kind of unspoken kindness that small villages keep on hand for moments like this one. She had carried the bag back to the car and set it carefully on the passenger seat. Then she had driven on more slowly the last mile down the lane. The house came into view the way it always had, set back from the lane behind a low stone wall, its slate roof catching the last of the sun. A single chimney, a wooden gate that had never quite closed properly. The garden ran on its own quiet rules now, herbs leaning into the path, lavender gone soft and gray at the edges, a rose bush nodding against the porch, as if waiting for someone to lean into it. Mara, parked in the lay-by where her grandmother used to park, killed the engine and listened. For a long moment she did not get out. Through the open window she could hear birds in the hedge, the small dry rustle of leaves, and beyond that, almost too quiet to notice, the faint rhythmic ticking of the old kitchen clock through the front window. Someone had wound it. Probably the neighbor who had promised to keep an eye on the place. The thought of that clock still ticking faithfully all this time settled something in her chest before she had even stepped out of the car. She gathered her bag from the passenger seat and walked slowly up the path. The gravel made the same dry sound under her shoes as it always had. The gate gave its familiar resistance, then its familiar give. The porch step had a worn dip in the middle from generations of feet, hers among them. The key turned without complaint. The smell hit her first. Not strong, not sad, just the smell of the house itself. old wood, dried herbs, a faint trace of wood smoke from winters past, and underneath all of that the powdery sweetness of the soap her grandmother had always used. It was a smell she had not known she was carrying inside her until it returned, and her shoulders dropped a full inch. The hallway was dim and cool. She set her bag down on the bench by the door, the same bench where boots and baskets and once a small black cat had always lived. The cat was long gone now. The bench remained. She walked through to the kitchen. It was exactly as it had always been. The wide stone sink under the window, the wooden table with its scrubbed pale top, 2 chairs on either side, the dresser along the back wall, its plates lined up like patient guests, the kettle on the stove, copper darkened with age, ready to be lifted. A small jar on the windowsill held a single sprig of rosemary that had dried to a soft gray green. Other small things lived where they had always lived. The wooden breadboard leaning against the wall behind the stove. The blue tin of tea on the second shelf of the dresser. The little glass dish where her grandmother had always kept the loose change from the bottom of her apron pocket, still with 2 small coins in it now, dulled by time. The wooden spoon hanging from its hook above the stove, the very one Mara would soon hold in her own hand without yet knowing it. The clock on the wall ticked, steady, calm, unhurried. The sound that had measured every visit of her childhood. Mara stood in the middle of the room and let it hold her for a while. She had come to spend the weekend here, alone, before the house was sold. Her father had asked her to look through what was left, decide what to keep, what to pass on, what to let go. He could not bring himself to do it. None of them could, really, but Mara had volunteered. There was something she wanted to do quietly, without anyone watching. She just had not yet named what it was. She crossed to the window and pushed it open. The smell of the garden came in, warm grass and something faintly sweet from the apple tree at the back. A small breeze moved the curtain against her arm. The kettle, when she filled it, made the same low whisper as always. By the time the tea was made and the chair pulled out and her hands wrapped around the warm cup, the light in the kitchen had shifted to a softer gold. She sat without thinking of much. The clock kept its rhythm. A bee hummed against the outside of the window pane and then drifted away. Somewhere up the lane a dog barked once, and then everything was quiet again. She drank her tea slowly. The cup was the white one with the small chip on the rim, the one her grandmother had always reserved for Mara because Mara had been the one who chipped it years ago, setting it down too hard at the breakfast table. Her grandmother had laughed at the time and had never replaced the cup and had always set it out for her ever since, as if to say, "See, the cup is still here, and so are you." The chip sat smooth and familiar against her lower lip now. She turned the cup once between her hands, and the chip moved away from her mouth and then back to it, and she smiled at the small private thing that no one else could have known about this cup. When the cup was empty, she rinsed it at the sink, set it upside down on the wooden draining board, and stood for a moment looking out at the garden. The apple tree was heavy with fruit. A small wooden bench leaned against the back wall under the kitchen window, its paint flaking gently. 2 robins were taking turns at the bird bath, drinking the way birds do, lifting their small heads to the sky between sips as if thanking the air. She wandered through the rest of the house slowly, room by room. The sitting room with its 2 deep armchairs by the fireplace, the woolen blanket folded neatly over the back of one of them, the grandfather clock in the corner, silent now, its pendulum still, the bookshelves with their faded spines, the books her grandmother had loved best on the lower shelf within easy reach. A small framed photograph on the mantelpiece of 2 girls in summer dresses, sitting on the front wall of this very house, laughing at something off camera. Her grandmother, her great-aunt, both gone now. The photograph still warm with sunlight from the window. She let her eyes move along the lower shelf of books. The poetry her grandmother had carried with her since she was a young woman. The garden book with its loose pressed leaves between the pages. The old hardback novel with the soft red cover that her grandmother had read aloud to her one rainy afternoon when she was 8. She did not take any of them down. She only let her fingers trail along the soft spines, recognizing each one in passing, the way you might walk slowly through a room of old friends without needing to greet any of them by name. The fireplace was clean and ready. A small basket of kindling beside it. A larger basket of split logs against the wall. A box of long matches on the mantelpiece beside the photograph. She would light a small fire later, perhaps. Or perhaps she would not. The candle would do for tonight. Mara touched the frame lightly and moved on. The dining room was as her grandmother had left it. The long oak table that had hosted so many quiet Sunday lunches, its surface marked here and there with the soft, pale rings of cups set down without saucers across the years. The sideboard with its drawers of folded linen, the napkins still pressed and stacked. A small bowl of pine cones in the center of the table, the pine cones gone dry and soft, gathered from the wood at the edge of the field. The smell here was of beeswax polish and old paper and something faintly herbal that might have been the dried lavender in the drawer of the sideboard. She lifted one of the napkins to her face. It smelled of lavender, too, and of the wooden drawer it had lived in. She folded it back into the stack and slid the drawer shut. The bedroom upstairs at the front of the house had its window open a crack, the curtain breathing. The bed was made up neatly. Someone, the neighbor again no doubt, had put fresh sheets on. The thought of that small kindness, performed without being asked, made her stand still for a long beat in the doorway. The room was small and low-ceilinged with a sloped wall on one side. a wooden chair by the bed, a washstand with a porcelain bowl and jug, both empty now, both kept exactly where they had always lived, a small rag rug on the floor in soft, faded colors. The window looked out across the back garden to the apple tree and the wall and the field beyond. She set her bag on the chair by the bed and stood at the window for a while. The field was a long pale gold in the late afternoon light, the kind of gold only cut hay and slow summer made together. A horse stood at the far edge of it, head down, tail flicking lazily. Looking at the horse made her shoulders soften further. In the small, involuntary way bodies sometimes recognize calm before the mind catches up, she went back downstairs slowly, one hand trailing along the polished wooden banister. The kitchen, when she returned to it, felt like the heart of the house. It always had. It was where her grandmother had spent most of her life, standing at the stove or sitting at the table with the radio low, hands always doing something gentle, peeling potatoes, folding tea towels, threading needles, stirring a pot of something on the back burner with a wooden spoon worn pale at the handle. Mara opened the cupboards one by one, not to start the work yet, just to look. Old earthenware bowls, a blue and white jug that had always held milk at breakfast, a row of glass jars with handwritten paper labels in her grandmother's looping script, flour, sugar, oats, salt. The labels yellowed at the corners, but the writing still clear, still cared for. In the lowest cupboard, behind a stack of cake tins, she found it. A square tin dented at one corner, with a faded illustration of cottage roses on the lid. She knew it the moment her hand closed around its edge. The recipe tin. She lifted it out carefully, the way you might lift something that had been sleeping, and set it on the kitchen table. She sat down. She did not open it yet. The tin had been her grandmother's mother's tin before that. Mara remembered being told this once, when she was small, in the way her grandmother told her things, casually, while doing something else. The tin had traveled across 2 villages and 1 ocean, and back again before settling on this kitchen counter. The small dent at the corner was from a long ago move. The faded roses had been bright once. The hinge still moved cleanly because someone had cared for it carefully across 100 years. The light through the window had gone from gold to a softer rose now, the late hour making everything in the kitchen a touch quieter. The clock ticked. Outside, the apple tree shifted slightly in the breeze. She rested her hand flat on the lid of the tin and just breathed for a while. Then she opened it. Inside, exactly as she remembered, was a stack of small recipe cards, some written in pencil, some in fountain pen, some clipped from old magazines and yellowed with age. Some had little notes in the margins, things like more salt than it says, or use the brown sugar if you can. She lifted them out a few at a time and set them on the table in soft fans, not reading them yet, just touching them, letting her fingers move over her grandmother's handwriting. Her grandmother's handwriting had been a careful, loose script, generous in the loops, patient in the curves. The kind of handwriting that came from a generation that had learned to write slowly and never quite stopped. Some cards were on the back of old envelopes, some on the inside of open cigarette packets her grandmother had saved during the war years, before she had given up smoking, before Mara was even born. Each card was a small archive of a life lived with care for ordinary things. Near the bottom, written on a thicker piece of card folded once down the middle, was the one she had been hoping to find. The cookies. The card was soft at the edges from being handled so many times. Her grandmother had written the title at the top in careful capitals. Warm cookies for a quiet house. Below, the ingredients in a tidy column, the method in long flowing sentences underneath. A note at the bottom, in a slightly more hurried hand, said simply, "Best with cold milk, eaten slowly." Mara read it twice. Then she set it gently on the table beside the tin and went to look in the cupboards. Everything she needed was still there. Flour in the jar with its yellowed label. Sugar, both white and brown, in jars beside it. A small tin of baking soda. A jar of oats. Salt in the little blue pot her grandmother had brought back from the coast one summer. Even the bottle of vanilla, dark and aromatic, behind the cinnamon. The butter she had brought herself in a small paper-wrapped block from the village shop on the drive-in. The eggs she had stopped for at the farm gate up the lane, paying coins into a tin and lifting them carefully into the carton from the bowl on the wooden shelf. There had been a hen wandering across the yard as she stood there, calm as anything, pausing to look at her with one round eye before moving on. She set everything out on the table in a neat row, the way her grandmother had always done. Mise en place, she had called it once, the only French phrase Mara had ever heard her use, said with a small, proud smile. She washed her hands at the sink. The water ran cool over her fingers. The soap on the windowsill was the same one as always, white, plain, smelling faintly of almonds. She dried her hands on the linen towel that hung from the handle of the stove door, the one with the embroidered flowers along the bottom that her grandmother had stitched herself years and years ago, and which still looked as bright as the day it had been finished. The oven was old. It needed lighting with a match. She knelt in front of it and turned the dial and waited for the small, soft whoosh of the gas catching, then closed the door and stood up slowly, knees aching just a touch from the cold of the tile floor. The kitchen began to warm. She measured the flour into the wide blue bowl that had always lived on the second shelf, watching the white of it mound up against the curve of the bowl. The sound of the flour falling was a small whispering sound, soft and continuous. She added the salt, the baking soda, a pinch of cinnamon, though the recipe did not call for it, because she remembered that her grandmother had always added a pinch of cinnamon, and the recipe was not the whole truth. The wooden scoop her grandmother had always used was still in the flour jar, smooth and pale at the handle. She used it the way she had been taught to use it, lifting the flour without packing it down, leveling it gently against the rim of the jar with the side of her finger. There was a small, simple pleasure in that motion, in doing something exactly the way she had been shown how to do it long ago. She sifted the dry mixture twice with a little hand sieve she found in the second drawer down, the same little hand sieve she remembered standing on tiptoe to reach for as a child. The flour drifted down through the mesh in soft clouds. Some of it settled on the wooden table, a fine pale dusting, and she did not wipe it away. It looked as it had always looked. The butter she creamed with the sugars in the smaller bowl. The wooden spoon, worn pale at the handle, fit her hand the way a tool fits a hand that has used it many times before, even though this was, in fact, her first time using this particular spoon. The motion of stirring was simple and rhythmic. The butter softened into the sugar, and the sugar dissolved slowly into the butter, and the color of it turned from yellow to pale gold to the soft, creamy beige of something almost ready. She paused once and tasted a small fingertip of the mixture. It was sweet and rich and faintly grainy, the way it always was at this stage, before the eggs went in. Her grandmother had taught her that this was the cook's portion, a small, private moment that only the person standing at the counter ever got to share. She cracked the eggs in one at a time. The yolks were a deep orange, the color of the late afternoon sun on the kitchen floor. She added the vanilla, a slow, careful pour, and the smell of it rose up out of the bowl and into the room and made the kitchen feel even more like her grandmother's kitchen than it had a moment before. The flour mixture went in slowly, folded with the wooden spoon, the dough thickening with each pass. She added the oats last. The dough turned soft and rough and pleasingly heavy, the spoon now requiring a firmer hand to move it through the mass. She stopped to rest her wrist for a moment and looked out the window. The garden had gone a deeper rose gold. Long shadows from the apple tree stretched across the grass. A small brown bird sat on the wall, fluffed against the cooling air, and watched her with no particular interest. The clock on the wall ticked. The kettle made a soft pinging sound as the metal cooled from the earlier boiling. The oven gave off its low, warm hum. She turned back to the dough and finished folding. The baking tray was old, blackened with use, exactly the right kind of tray for this kind of cookie. She rolled the dough into balls between her palms, the way she remembered being taught, and set them on the tray with space between each one. They looked small and humble. She liked that about them. There was no ambition in a cookie. It only had to be itself. The dough was cool against her palms, slightly tacky, smelling already of the warmth it would soon become. She rolled them slowly, taking her time, lining them up in 3 neat rows of 4, 12 in all, just enough for the night and for the morning after, with a few left over for the journey home. Into the oven. The door closed with a soft thud. The smell began almost at once. It rose out of the oven and filled the kitchen slowly, the way warm bread fills a room, the way fresh coffee fills a room, the way certain memories fill a room when you are not quite ready for them. Vanilla, brown sugar, butter, the faintest backing note of cinnamon, the smell of being small, the smell of standing on a wooden chair beside this very table while her grandmother lifted the tray out and let her have one too soon, when they were still so warm they almost burned her fingers, and she ate it anyway, breathing it in around the edges of each bite. Mara stood at the counter and breathed it in now, and her eyes filled, but it was not a sad fullness. It was the fullness of being met by something you thought you had lost. She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist and turned back to the kitchen. She poured a glass of milk while the cookies baked. The milk was cold from the small fridge that hummed in the corner, the same fridge that had hummed in the corner her whole life. She poured it slowly into a tall glass, the white of it filling the glass with a soft sliding sound, and set it on the table beside her grandmother's recipe card. She lit the candle on the dresser, a small white one, plain, the kind her grandmother had kept stored in a tin in the cupboard for occasions that did not need announcing. The flame caught and steadied and made a soft pool of yellow light against the dark wood. While the cookies baked, she walked once around the kitchen, hands behind her back, looking at the row of jars on the dresser, at the wooden spoon hanging from its hook above the stove, at the small framed embroidery on the wall by the door, a sampler of letters and flowers that her grandmother's own grandmother had stitched as a girl, the colors faded almost to ghosts. At the long shelf of cookbooks above the dresser, their spines softened with use. At the calendar still pinned to the back of the larder door, 2 months out of date, the little square for last Tuesday marked with a small pencil tick that meant nothing now and yet meant everything. She returned to the table and sat down. The warmth from the oven reached her shoulders. The smell from the oven reached every part of her at once. The oven timer was an old wind-up one, shaped like an apple. It ticked loudly on the table beside her. She watched the hand move slowly around its face, listening to the smaller ticking of the wall clock underneath, the 2 rhythms working together, the kitchen humming with their soft conversation. When the timer rang, she lifted the tray out with the linen cloth folded into a thick pad and set it on the wooden board on the counter. The cookies were a deep golden brown at the edges, paler in the middle, just slightly soft to the touch. Exactly right. She lifted one with the spatula and set it on a small white plate. She let them rest a moment on the tray. The kitchen filled with the small ticking sounds of the metal cooling. The smell deepened in that pause, the way bread smell deepens in the minute after it leaves the oven, when all the warmth gathers up at once and finds its way into every corner of the room. She stood at the counter and watched the steam rise off the cookies in soft, thin curls and disappear into the air above the candle. She carried the plate and the milk to the table. She sat in the chair her grandmother had always sat in. The chair fit her differently now than it had when she was small, her feet flat on the floor, her elbows resting easily on the table. The afternoon had gone properly, and the light was the soft blue-gray of evening coming on. The candle on the dresser made the only warm light in the room now, and the kitchen felt close and held. She ate the first cookie slowly, the warmth of it, the give of the center, the slight crisp of the edge, the vanilla and the brown sugar and the smallest whisper of cinnamon her grandmother had never quite admitted to. The cold milk to follow, sliding down clean and cool and turning the inside of her mouth into a small, soft echo of the cookie's warmth. She closed her eyes for a moment. The clock ticked. A small wind moved through the apple tree outside the window. The candle on the dresser flickered once and settled. The hum of the fridge in the corner went quiet for a long beat, and then began again, low and patient. She opened her eyes. The kitchen was just the kitchen. The cookies were just cookies. And yet, sitting there with the warm plate and the cold glass and the soft yellow flame, she felt a kind of peace she had not felt for a long time. The kind of peace that comes when a thing you are carrying without knowing it gets gently set down. She took her time. She ate 3 of them. She drank the milk in slow swallows. She sat with the plate in front of her long after the last cookie was gone, looking at the way the candle moved against the wall, at the way her grandmother's recipe card lay open on the table beside the tin, at the way the evening kept on arriving softly through the open window. Somewhere in the middle of the second cookie, a memory had come back to her, gentle as a hand on a shoulder. She had been 7, perhaps 8. It had been raining, the kind of slow, steady rain that lasted whole afternoons. She had been sitting in the very chair she was sitting in now, swinging her legs because they had not yet reached the floor. Her grandmother had set a plate down in front of her, 3 cookies, a glass of milk, and had said, in that quiet voice she had used for important things, "Eat them slowly, love. They taste better that way. The whole world tastes better that way." Mara had laughed then because she was small and easy with laughter. She had not understood. She had eaten the cookies fast because they were warm and good and she was hungry. Her grandmother had only smiled and poured her another glass of milk and said nothing more about it. She understood it now. Sitting in the same chair, in the same kitchen, with the same candle on the dresser, she understood it the way you only ever understand the small things people tell you in childhood, which is to say much later, when the person who told you them is no longer in the room. She did not feel sad. The understanding itself was a kind of company. She picked up the third cookie and ate it the way her grandmother had told her to all those years ago. Slowly, with attention, the first bite, just the edge, just enough to feel the slight crispness give way to softness. The second, deeper into the middle, where the dough was still faintly warm, the cold milk in between, washing the sweetness clean, leaving the mouth ready for the next small pleasure. There was nothing else to do. There was nowhere else to be. The kitchen was warm and the candle was steady, and the world had narrowed down to this small, bright circle around the table. When she set the empty plate down, she felt the weight of the day settle along her shoulders the way a coat settles when it is finally hung up. Not heavy, just placed. After a while, she got up and washed the bowl and the wooden spoon and the spatula. She set them on the wooden draining board to dry. She wiped the table down with the linen cloth. She lifted the small jar of dried rosemary from the windowsill and set it back exactly where it had been. The water from the tap was cool over her wrists. The soap on the windowsill smelled faintly of almonds, the same as always. She took her time with each thing, drying the spoon with the linen cloth, polishing the bowl until the inside of it shone in the candlelight. There was no hurry. The kitchen seemed to slow with her, the clock ticking a fraction more softly, the candle on the dresser burning a fraction more steadily. She left the rest of the cookies on a plate on the counter, covered with the upturned blue bowl, the way her grandmother had always covered things meant for the next day. She lit a second candle, smaller, in the holder by the hearth in the sitting room. She carried her tea, freshly made, into the deep armchair and sat down. The blanket over the back of the chair was the soft gray wool one, and she pulled it down across her lap, and the weight of it was the right kind of weight, the kind that asks for nothing. The room was very quiet. The grandfather clock in the corner stayed silent. The kitchen clock down the hall ticked on, a thread of sound the house had been holding for as long as she could remember. She drank her tea slowly. The chair was deeper than she remembered. Or perhaps she was smaller in it than she remembered, the way grown people sometimes feel small again in the rooms of their childhood, the proportions never quite matching the proportions in memory. The cushion was soft against her back. The wing of the chair held her head when she let it rest. Her feet were warm where the blanket reached them. She thought about her grandmother and did not feel like crying. She thought about the cookies and the recipe tin and the candle and the way the kitchen had felt when the smell of vanilla had begun to rise. She thought about the small kindnesses of the neighbor who had wound the clock and put fresh sheets on the bed and left the herbs to dry on the sill. She thought about the apple tree, heavy with fruit, and about how she could pick some in the morning and take them home. She thought too about the summer she had stayed here for a whole month when she was 9 years old. Her parents had been moving house. and her grandmother had said it was easier this way, and Mara had not known then how much that month would settle into her bones. The mornings had begun with the same smell of bread from the oven. The afternoons had been spent down at the bottom of the garden, tying string between sticks for runner beans, listening to the slow drone of a small plane somewhere far up in the blue. The evenings had ended exactly like this. A blanket, a cup, her grandmother in the other chair. Sometimes a book read aloud, sometimes nothing at all but the soft tick of the clock and the shifting of the embers in the grate. She had not known then how rare those evenings were. She knew it now. The candle by the hearth flickered. The house breathed around her. Outside, the evening was settling in properly now. A single bird called from the hedge and was answered by another. The lane beyond the gate was empty and quiet. The light in the sky had gone from blue-gray to lavender, and the first small star had come out over the apple tree, though Mara did not see it yet. She sat with the warm cup in her hands. She thought about how, in the morning, she would walk through the rooms again and decide which things to keep. The recipe tin would come with her, the blue and white milk jug, the wooden spoon worn pale at the handle, the linen cloth with the embroidered flowers, the small framed photograph from the mantelpiece, the blanket across her lap, perhaps. Not very much, but the right things. She would leave the clock for whoever came next. The clock belonged to the house. She would leave the bench in the hallway too, and the deep armchair she was sitting in now, and the long oak table in the dining room. Some things were too much a part of the rooms to be lifted out of them. Some things only made sense where they had always been. There was no sadness in that thought. There was only a kind of careful gladness, the gladness of recognizing what belonged where. Her tea cooled slowly in the cup. The candle by the hearth burned down a little. The chair held her gently. Her shoulders felt loose for the first time in a long time. The blanket on her lap was warm where it touched her legs. The room around her was the color of old honey in the candlelight. She let her head rest back against the soft wing of the chair. She thought she would close her eyes for just a moment. The day had been a long one, and the chair was deep, and the blanket was warm, and the kitchen down the hall still smelled faintly of the cookies cooling on the counter. The candle by the hearth shed a soft circle of gold against the wall. The grandfather clock kept its silence. Only the small kitchen clock kept the time, and the time it kept was the slow time of an old house at the end of a long day. The kitchen clock ticked on. The fridge hummed. The candle flickered. The house settled into the small night sounds it had always made. The soft tick of cooling wood, the whisper of wind through the gap above the front door, the distant call of an owl from somewhere across the field. She breathed in slowly, out slowly. The smell of the kitchen still hung faintly in the air. Warm vanilla, brown sugar, the smallest whisper of cinnamon, the smell of being small, the smell of being held. Her hands grew loose around the cup. She set it gently on the small table beside the chair. The candle by the hearth flickered once and steadied. The clock kept ticking. The blanket grew warm. Her breath grew slow. She thought of the apple tree outside the window. She thought of how, in the morning, the kitchen would smell faintly of the cookies still. She thought of the kettle on the stove, the blue jug, the wooden spoon. Each thought softer than the one before, each one more like a color than a word. She thought of her grandmother's hands, the shape of them, the way they had moved across the table as she set things down. Slow, sure, always finishing what they began. The thought stayed with her a while and then drifted, like the smell of vanilla in the room, like the candlelight on the wall. The cookies waited under the blue bowl on the kitchen counter. The recipe tin sat on the table beside them. The candle burned low in the dresser. The evening held the house. The house held her. Outside, the apple tree shifted in the breeze. A second star came out, then a third. The lane beyond the gate was quiet. The hedge was still. The horse in the field had lain down at last. Mara breathed in, out. The clock ticked. The candle flickered. The blanket was warm. The house was still. She slept.